Greetings, everyone. I'm Glenn Wharton, chair of the UCLA Getty Interdepartmental Program in the Conservation of Cultural Heritage. Welcome to another event in our Distinguished Lecture Series. In this series, we invite leaders in allied fields whose work touches on issues related to cultural heritage conservation. And today, we will hear from two curators, Erica Jones and Carlee Forbes, about an exhibition that they co-curated at the Fowler Museum titled Belongings, Changing Hands and Shifting Meanings in African Arts. It is currently on view, and I highly recommend seeing it to audience members who are in Los Angeles. This lecture is co-sponsored by the Fowler Museum and supported by a generous donation from Jeffrey P. Cunard. As a land-grant institution, we acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of the Tovang-Gar, the Los Angeles Basin, and South Channel Islands. The UCLA Getty Conservation Program and the Fowler Museum regularly collaborate with Tongva and other Native colleagues. We are pleased that a number of our students are preparing their careers to research, care for, and repatriate Indigenous cultural heritage. Erica Jones is the Senior Curator of African Arts and Manager of Curatorial Affairs at the Fowler Museum. Her curatorial work has engaged such themes as the legacies of colonialism in Africa, historical royal arts, and resonances between Africa and its diasporas. Exhibitions she has curated or co-curated include The House Was Too Small, Yoruba Sacred Arts from Africa and Beyond, Inheritance, Recent Video Art from Africa, on display in the Walled City, the Nigerian Pavilion at the British Empire Exhibition, and Maleko Magosi, Bread, Butter, and Power. Carlee Forbes is Associate Curator of African and Oceanic Art at the Baltimore Museum of Art. She has previous experience at the Samuel P. Harn Museum of Art, Auckland Art Museum, North Carolina Museum of Art, and she was previously part of a Mellon-funded research team at the Fowler Museum. Her research focuses on provenance histories as a lens for illuminating social, cultural, and political histories. Her curatorial practice speaks to redefining the art historical canon by making community collaborations in care and display practices. Exhibitions she has curated or co-curated include Exchange, Particular Histories, Provenance Research in African Arts, Evidence and Expertise, Congo Across the Waters, and the 2017 reinstallation of the long-term African art galleries at the North Carolina Museum of Art. With that, I will now turn it over to Erica and Carlee.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thanks, Glenn. So happy to be here and sharing this exhibition with folks. Thanks, Erica, for sharing. So I will get us started. Welcome to our exhibition presentation for Belongings, Changing Hands and Shifting Meanings in African Arts. I hope those of you who are in Los Angeles are able to go see the show. And we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts today.
Yeah.
So where we got started with this show was really with the 2019 and ongoing Mellon project at the Fowler Museum, looking at the archives related to collections of the objects currently in the care of the Fowler. Thinking about provenance or ownership histories of those works and how that plays out on a day-to-day basis is that you spend a absolute insane amount of time looking at archives, cards, photos, journal entries, everything in between. A lot of paper gets involved. But as we were continuing with that, I have our cool slide transition here.
Yeah. As we were working through those archives, I think one thing really stood out to us time and time again, and that was just the human stories that kept emerging, all of the people whose lives have been touched by the objects that are currently at the Fowler. And And so that was really the impetus for this exhibition. You know, we were sort of thinking that so many exhibitions on historical African arts really focus on histories of use. Um, and we really wanted to take this opportunity to mobilize what we had learned through the archive to redirect this narrative. And so this exhibition really focuses on the lesser known histories that are layered within each object. And all of these objects, it's really inextricable that they are also then shaped by these movements, the exchange, and these shifting contexts that they have sort of existed within over the course of their lives. Um, Understanding the people who have had a piece of the lives of these objects helps us sort of put together a little more about the many conditions that these objects have existed in and the dynamic relationships that they kind of embody. And so that's sort of something that Carlee and I have been working on, is thinking about these objects through a lens that we're calling interstitial provenance, which is really thinking about the in-betweens in the provenance, those in between the names, and what that tells us about the pieces and those moments in history. So I think we're gonna dive in and take you through this show. It's broken up into 4 sections. The first section focuses on African makers and owners. The second section that we will talk about is about these objects as European tokens of empire. The third section is about the market for African arts in Europe, and then our final section is about the arrival of these pieces at the Fowler Museum.
Great. So jumping in, section 1, we are, as Erica said, throughout this show, really thinking about the people who are involved, how works can have many different interpretations. It's not going to be a show that just focuses on the original intended use or just one aspect of these works. We really invite you to come into this space and to think about how we're going to root you in different moments of time around different narratives, and to consider what else we might not be telling you. You know, museums are not, they're limited by the amount of space that we have to share stories. So ask more questions, really, would be a goal of this. So starting with African makers and owners, we are situated on the continent, largely in the early to mid 20th century, thinking about the people who originally made and owned these works. So we start thinking about, sorry, Eric, I'm not quite done.
Sorry, go back.
Not just the artists there, but also the people who are responsible for their movements. So really situating ourselves on the continent at these early moments in an object's so-called life.
And so the first piece that we bring to the visitor is this wonderful gourd. And as Carlee just said, situating on the continent, we also want to problematize what that means, situating on the continent, because this gourd was carved by a Nigerian carver, Adumai Ali Jeta, actually outside of London in around 1924, 1925. The artist was one of the participants at the British Empire exhibition, which was sort of a World's Fair that the British put on in 1924 and 1925 to boost intercolonial trade. They wanted trade within the empire to be ramped up so that they could continue to basically increase their wealth. And part of the West African offerings to visitors to the expo was the opportunity to see artists at work. And so they brought metal workers and weavers and leather workers and also a gourd carver. And so when we think about this object, this is an African object created in London using African techniques, using Nigerian resources, because the gourd would have come from Nigeria, but being made for a British audience, really. And what we loved about including this piece is that it's really about the artistic ingenuity that we see here, that this is an artist who is innovating within his own style. He's not making exactly what he would make for a local audience home in Nigeria. He is taking his skills and turning it towards what's going to sell. and what people want to see. And so it is a series of wonderful vignettes of life in Nigeria, but also life in London, and sort of these things coming together in this one object.
The next object in this section is this rattle. It's woven out of plant fiber. And really interestingly, you can see that the bottom of one of the containers for the material that makes the noise, there is a label that reads Saturday E. Fenny and dates when the work was begun and when it was finished. And so as we were working on this provenance project, this piece was a particularly interesting piece to think about. Knowing that it came, like we have this name on the bottom, there's another group associated with it, the Church Missionary Society in Nigeria, also collected it in 1949. It went to the Wellcome Collection shortly after and then came to UCLA. So we were trying to figure out, what's this relationship between the maker? Do we know anything more about them? Is it something that the missionaries are commissioning from a known artist? Is it something that is documenting, say, a student's work at a mission school, which were really prominent at this time, this making of various, what was thought to be handcrafts at the mission schools. And given the documentation on the bottom, that's kind of where today, January 30th, 2026, I fall on. That can change depending on the day and how you're feeling. But I do believe that this is probably the product of a mission school. So much like the Wembley piece that allows us to think about artists on the move, this piece really helps us to focus on what we consider an artist, how do we define that, can change based on context, but also to look at that very complex relationship between missionaries and artists and makers on the ground in Nigeria in the mid-century.
Our final example from this first section is a table that would have previously been in the Sultan's palace in Fumban, previously owned by Sultan Ibrahim Njoya. And so with this inclusion, we wanted to think about objects as ambassadors and how owners of African arts in Africa were utilizing these objects for more than just, again, their original use. This is something that clearly had been used as a table. This would have been next to a stool or a throne, maybe to hold the king's palm wine or something. But as you can see from the damage at the front, this is something that was eaten away a little bit by wood rot, likely. And so it was most likely no longer in use when Njoya took this table and gifted it to a visitor to his kingdom. Mary Hastings Bradley was a woman who traveled through Africa and then would sort of write and tell stories about this afterwards, a Chicago native, traveling the world. And she visited and he gave this to her in a really just emblematic of how King Njoya was this great diplomat, that he understood quite profoundly the value of gifting objects to visitors to his kingdom, that these are the objects, these portable objects, although whether this table is portable, I think, is somewhat debatable. It's a pretty big table to be carting around and then bring home, but different standards in the 1930s. That, this is something you take home with you. And then it is a reminder of the incredible experience, the power of the Bamum kingdom. And so this is a way that these pieces, these belongings were really mobilized to larger political interests in the Bamum kingdom at this time. In our next section, we move into the topic of European tokens of empire. And so we have here a selection of 3 pieces that really allow us to get at the various reasons that Europeans were traveling to Africa at this time. And so through these 3 pieces, we're able to discuss topics of administrators, anthropologists, missionaries, and journalists or travelers, activists, all who are traveling to Africa during the colonial period and the various reasons, and also the various types of baggage that this really brings along in our contemporary discussions of these pieces. To what degree do we need to address the range of experiences that colonized communities had with administrators, missionaries, journalists? And we're able to do that, especially in the gallery when we have visitors come and look at these pieces in this section.
So we'll start with this rather fantastical jar that was created in Nigeria and brought back to the UK by one Mervyn David Walgrave Jeffreys, or MDW Jeffreys as he's known in the archive. And he is probably the epitome of complex history that we've been trying to unravel throughout the course of this project. On the one hand, he is a quite well-known colonial administrator. He's a South African born, but worked for the British administration for quite some time in Nigeria. While at the same time, he is a PhD anthropology person working with a university in London to write a dissertation about African art that he's viewing on the ground. So we're balancing several different interests here. On the one hand, he is part of a system that is very systematically trying to disenfranchise Nigerian landowners and to revert land rights to the British, to control trade routes, etc. He had quite a few nicknames that are not very nice, and showing his sternness and his real deftness in negotiating for the British. But on the other hand, he's also someone who's interested in processes of making, in artistry, in thinking about how we can understand the creativity that's happening around him. And so we think about this jar as a real encapsulation of that, and how it can have multiple different agendas for its collecting. On the one hand, he might be trying to, set a certain precedent with a certain market seller to try to negotiate various administrative things. But also he collected quite a few pots at this time. And so he might have also been thinking about variations in form and how this might be a documentation of various artistic practices. And because we don't have a specific voice from him writing about this exact piece at this exact time, it's kind of left for us to sit with that ambiguity of its collecting as both an ethnographic specimen and a tool of the administration.
Continuing with the ambiguity, we have this striking sesa that is just an exceptional example of a very rare type of masquerade from the Cameroon grass fields. This was collected in the 19-teens, 1920s by Reverend Frank Crystal, who was a missionary living in this region. When it comes to thinking about missionaries and their roles throughout colonial Africa, you have a real spread. You have a real range, that you have people who are there and proselytizing and intentionally disenfranchising communities of their religious objects as part of their forced conversion on one end of the spectrum. And then you have people who are a little more, I don't want to say innocuous, but people who are not there with a intent to dispossess. And in that, we sort of see Frank Crystal. From what we've read and what we've learned about him, it seems like among his most sort of ardent passions in Cameroon was really just to learn all of the local names for medicinal herbs. He was just seemingly an extremely big nerd when it came to this, and this is what gave him the most joy in his time there. But what we also see in his collecting is that whatever he was doing and however he was engaging, he was also sort of enmeshed in a very prestigious, high-ranking milieu in the kingdoms that he was working in. Because really most of what he's bringing back are these royal or notable objects from the community. So it's really hard to say to what degree these are. We don't know if they're purchased or if they're gifts for the most part. And we don't know whether this is an appeasement or it is a genuine sort of indication of his stature within the community. And that is not in his written record. So again, we live in this ambiguity around this piece as well, and everything else that's connected to Crystal.
Next, we come to when you visit the gallery, this piece is, we have it so nicely large on our screens here. It is quite a bit smaller than you would think it is. It's a hairpin made of ivory. And so it is quite small, but I really encourage you to take a good close look. It's a really stunningly beautiful piece. And this piece came about out of the continent from Congo by a Mrs. May French Sheldon, who, like the other three in this section, is a very complicated lady. She is someone who really embodied a sense of adventurous spirit. She did a large trip in the 1890s through Eastern Africa and then returned to the continent in 1903 as a commissioned traveler to document some of the atrocities that were happening in the Belgian Congo at that time. So at the time, 1903, it's still the Congo Free State, not become yet the Belgian Congo, the personal property of King Leopold II, and some truly atrocious policies were happening there, very exploitative, very violent. And so she was sent there to document it. In a great turn of events, she comes back basically saying, yeah, I didn't see any of that. Everything's pretty okay. And turns out she was also accepting money from the supporters of the Congo Free State at the time. So she was really playing both sides of that political game. And so we see her as this very complicated person intertwined within the colonial system while not yet exactly participating as part of the administration. But on the other hand, also, when you read about her, she's someone who is so passionate about advocating for women's rights. So you really have to read into that also, that she was very much supporting only some women's rights, reading between the lines there. But in thinking about how all of that really twines together and understanding this hairpin, we're really left to question under what conditions she acquired this work. Is it something that she acquired in that first trip throughout Eastern Africa that would have then traded through the eastern part of Congo over towards the Great Lakes side, or like through trade networks that extended towards the Indian Ocean in that way? Or is this a hairpin that moved towards the western coast through other various trade networks? So I guess I did miss explaining. The hairpin doesn't seem to align with any of her trips stylistically, where she had been and where we identify it as originating due to its style. So we're left to question how she acquired it and how this hairpin itself might be very illustrative of various trade networks within Congo. And then, tying it even more into why she would have collected it as part of her various journeys and trips and agendas. Super. So we move into our third section here, where we are moving entirely off of the continent of Africa and looking at how works then circulate through markets and systems in Europe, largely thinking about how they become divorced from the context of creation. In our archival work, we see an extreme loss of data about original makers and owners that we've emphasized in the first two sections. And really thinking, again, in this exhibition that's exploring the multiple meanings of objects and how they can serve different purposes over their lives, how distinctly in this movement off of the continent, the works take on an extreme amount of many new meanings for those owners and serve an entirely different set of agendas. You got this, Erica. You muted.
Sorry, I couldn't get myself off mute there. So thinking about objects moving off the continent, they as these pieces entered Europe during the colonial period, they began this like slow diaspora through auction houses and galleries and shops, sort of really moving out throughout Europe. And eventually, this specific piece ended up in the collection of either the poet André Breton or sorry, the artists and poets André Breton and Paul Eluard, the founding fathers of Surrealism. Um, and Breton and Eluard, they were part of this sort of set of European artists right in the early in the teens and the 20s who latched onto objects like this as embodiments of alternate perspectives on how societies could function. And so their fascination led them to amass a pretty sizable collection that they were sourcing from shops throughout England, Holland, and France. Um, and so I think when we look at this object, it's a really interesting encapsulation of how a work like this, this Demba figure is coming out of Guinea. It's really divorced from that history when it's being collected by Breton and Eluard, that they are really focusing on it purely as a representation of Africa and what they imagine an African mindset to be. Um, and so, this piece it has this interesting history where they have been collecting throughout the teens and the 20s, and then the crash comes in. And in 1931, both Breton and Eluard are strapped for cash. They really need to raise funds. And so they have this massive sale in 31 of their entire collection. And this piece, among many others, I think there are over 300 lots, are sold off and sort of re-enter this diaspora market, that it goes back in, that it goes into museums and private collections all over again. But still, these pieces retain that inherent sort of moment in time, I think, because of their connection to Breton and Eluard, that we can never really divorce them from the narrative of how it was mobilized in a very primitivizing way to create the foundations of sort of European art movements that dominated through the 20th century.
So thinking about our second example in this section, we have this yellow-tinged brass memorial sculpture. And this one was a real befuddler during our provenance research. And I really have to thank our colleague Kate for helping make some really fantastic archival finds to help us to understand this. But what we do understand is that given the artistic style, the casting style, the color, all of it, that this piece really originates in the kingdom of Owo in Nigeria. It is adjacent to the kingdom of Benin, which some of our viewers might be knowledgeable about, the famous raid on Benin City in 1897. And what we really were interested in this, Eric, can you click the animation?
Yep.
Was to think about the provenance of this work in that how it was sold. As a former commissioner of the Nigerian Administrative Service, this is sold as lot number 146, the second one written there in pencil, Benin bronze head. So we've been thinking a lot about how the claim here from this individual is that this piece comes from Benin. So much like the André Breton and Paul Eluard piece, there's this kind of invented sense of meaning that comes to accompany this piece by a insertion of a single different word. It's not a Owo bronze head. This is a Benin bronze head. And so through that, it's really connecting into systems of value that get brought about after the raid on Benin City, and this real ethos of colonial violence and triumph of the British imperial state over the Benin Kingdom. But then at the same time, there's also this celebration of Benin arts that's happening in Europe following the raid as a real triumph of artistic creation. And so we see how the person who sold this work, who is maybe perhaps likely a Captain A. Philip Pullen, again, thanks to Kate for finding and tracing down all of these things, that they're able to like really shift how a piece is understood and the value that's assigned to it, with affiliating various narratives, invented or not, to a piece when it goes on the market. Because that one simple change on this auction catalog, the Benin bronze head, follows this work through until it arrives at the Fowler and is reclassified a great deal later, 50, 60 years after it was first sold.
So our final piece in this section is a mask that was previously owned by the Baroness Catherine d'Erlanger, and the Baroness was something of a fabulous figure. She was a member of sort of the intelligentsia. She would host salons in her home, and she had an interest in European art. She was a painter herself, and part of being a member of this cosmopolitan intellectual set meant that in her collection she had a few pieces of African art sprinkled in amongst it. And this was really her signal to her artistic friends of what a member of sort of the global elite that she was. And so, this piece, which when you look at it, we're not certain that this isn't just something that was made for the tourist trade in probably the 1930s. It was really what was important, I think, to her about this was purely the aesthetics and the vague Africanness of the piece, that you have something that is symmetrical and geometric and mask-like, with a female form at the top, that these are all going to tick all of the boxes that she's looking for in this performative cosmopolitanism that is such a part of how she's a member of society. And so this piece is really, again, thinking about this secondary market so fully divorced from its origins in Nigeria, and even potential, if it had any original use. It is merely a token in that sense. And this is reinforced by its eventual sale, how it left her collection. It was sold at Sotheby's in the 30s, in 1932. And it was in a lot, there were 6 lots that were connected to the Baroness, and they were the first lots in the sale. They bore her name. They were sort of 6, largely, if I'm being honest, unremarkable objects, but it was purely, again, this connection to her that then made them valuable and noteworthy for Sotheby's to even include, to sort of kick off the sale. And so, this is in many ways this wonderful encapsulation of the ways that people are using African objects in Europe in this period as ways of sort of conveying their own identity. This is not part of their personal historical tradition, but by owning it, this is part of their identity formation, and how they share that publicly with their friends and society at large. The Baroness goes on to have quite a life as well, coming to Los Angeles later in the 40s, but that's a story for another time.
And in our final section, we really think about how museums play a role in the definition and understanding of objects, and particularly using the arrival of the objects at the Fowler Museum at UCLA. A large portion of our research concentrated on a gift that arrived in 1965 to 67, a gift of 30,000 works when the museum is just 2 years old, is a remarkable amount of works for a museum to process. And they do it in just a couple of years, putting on a big exhibition at the end of December 1965 after that first year. And so what we wanted to do in this section, again, thinking about how objects acquire meaning, is to move beyond some of the work that has been done through projects like World Arts Local Lives and the big publication that happened that focus on the UCLA systems that have allowed the Fowler to become into being what it is today, about the chancellors and the first curators, and to think about what that collection meant for the students who were on campus at the time of its arrival. And we had an amazing opportunity, first working with the UCLA librarians and Garcia the Fowler, to consider the photograph collection that documented the gift's arrival, where we were able to then find the names of some of the students who unpacked the objects, and then going through and reconnecting with some of those individuals and to hear about their experience, what it meant. You're a second year master's student and you're invited to come to the new museum and unpack stuff, catalog it, get to see it first, and to really hear about what the ethos of that time was, what it meant for that collection to be coming to Los Angeles. So we have this rather remarkable photo from the LA Times archive where we see 5 students, and 2 of the students that we talked to were Mike, who's there in the back, Eric, if you want to point to him.
Yep.
There, and then Carrie, who is on the right. And so you'll see in the gallery a really fantastic interview selection with Carrie, who lives in Northern California now, speaking about her days working with the museum, what it was like to unpack, what it was like to record all of this information. And as we're like reflecting on the rest of the exhibition, we've talked a lot about how objects acquire different meaning. And we think about these graduate students, like they were the ones recording what was going on around them. Some of the provenance work we have done with the collection would not have been possible without their notes, because they're recording stickers, tags, labels, things that are written on objects that through the course of their time at Fowler have since been separated, or sometimes, ink fades over time or papers become less readable. So they've really provided a set of understanding that allows us to then think through what those objects mean today. And in thinking about our conversations with Mike and Carrie, Carrie also recounted this great story of unpacking some of the Asante material and hearing what a fly whisk sounded like as it was leaving the box, this like gentle tinkling noise, and how impressed she was by that. And now, like thinking about how objects continue to live lives at the museum, that is one of the pieces that was returned to Ghana, to the Asante Hene, in 2024, 150 years after it was taken. And so we see how objects don't just stop acquiring meaning, don't just stop acquiring significance or lives or actions within the museum, but it becomes a space where meaning can be made and remade over time with multiple constituencies. So now we're part of that, all of us together, reinterpreting those objects and continuing to see how they move forward in the future today.
Yeah.
I can't believe we did that talk almost.
I know that we've gotten this in at 11:38. This is shocking for us. I think maybe the place where we can end, and then we'll have Glenn come back in, is to say that we've told you this story, right? We have told you the story as Carlee and I have written this text in the gallery. But part of this story, part of our intention here is to remind every visitor that every story you read at a museum is just one story. And so to further underline that, we commissioned 3 scholars to write alternative texts as well. So I'm just gonna, so we had this emerging scholar who was a summer intern with us, Alana Joy Okonkwo, write 3 pieces utilizing critical fabulation as the lens through which she approached pieces in this exhibition. Working with Marcy Jeffcoat Burton, who was a former Mellon Fellow with us in conservation, she took the approach of material studies and conservation science. And again, she chose one piece from each section in the show to write about. And finally, Aaron Panofsky, who's the director of and a professor in UCLA's Institute for Society and Genetics, took this through the lens of sociology and questions of function. And so we think of this, it's a little bit of a choose your own adventure. Come select one of these topics that is most exciting to you, and you can take a pamphlet off the wall and get an entirely different set of texts to go with the objects, to just underscore this idea that objects contain so much. There are so many stories, so many ciphers through which we can sort of think of them. And that every time you come to a museum, it's an opportunity to sort of be challenged to think about something in a new and different way. And so that is belongings.
Wow. Thank you, Erica and Carlee, for a really, really interesting presentation and just a great exhibition that you put together. This was particularly fascinating for me, hearing the complex stories about very complex people associated with these objects over their lives and how they changed over time and place. I like how you um, place these stories in a larger social and political context. That was, just very well done. And I'm deeply struck by how your research parallels a primary focus of our program, which is to research people associated with objects in our care. One of the core values associated with our mission statement is collaborative practice, in which we work with people whose cultural heritage we are preserving, to understand their concerns about how these objects should be conserved and stored and exhibited. So it's a very interesting parallel between what's going on in the curatorial world and what's going on in the conservation world as well. So I have a number of questions that we can have for discussion, but I'm also going to keep my eye on the Q&A. So audience members are welcome. We won't be able to get to all the questions that come in, but we can get to some of them. I thought I would lead by just asking you about the title of the exhibition, Belongings, Changing Hands and Shifting Meanings in African Arts. It strikes me that the word belongings may have several different meanings. I'm just curious what you were thinking about that word, but the title in general.
Carlee, do you want to take this? I feel like I feel like you came up with this title. Belongings feels like a Carlyism, I think.
I lost that thread this time, but whoever did. So yeah, we're definitely, Glenn, thanks for that question, playing on a dual sense of the word here. Often museums talk about the ownership of objects. Belongings are things that are owned by a person. But we also have this sense of the fact that belongings can also talk about you can belong to a place, you can feel a sense of belonging, an affiliation with a place. And so, as this exhibition thinks a lot about how objects move between both people and places, we want to think about them both in being affiliated with people, but then how they gain this sense, these other senses of meaning as they move through different physical spaces, as they acquire different senses of belongings. And I think one of the great things that one of the additional tours that Alana helped to write was she's using this critical fabulation approach from the point she's talking from the point of the objects, and there is this sense of discomfort with many of the objects. Who am I? What does it mean that I've moved along? Like I am a gourd that was made in the UK. I've never, like, as a carved gourd, never been in Nigeria. What does that mean for me to connect to this mother space? And I think it gives us a real opportunity to think about the I guess the underlying emotions that go with the movement of objects, not just the legal and really transactional nature of their exchange, but what does that mean? And helps us to get to those greater senses that we're exploring throughout the exhibition.
Let me throw one more question out. There are questions coming in on the Q&A now, but I'll ask at least one more. I love archival research, and apparently you do too, because you just discover things in boxes and written on the back of photographs. And could you describe, were there any highlights that you might convey from the research that you did? Any surprises that you learned from doing this archival research in preparation for the exhibition?
How much time you have?
Yeah, right. That could be the rest of the time we're here. I mean, I think there are a lot of there were a lot of surprises. I think there were a lot of surprises in terms of the specificity of the histories that were written down in the archive that hadn't made it into the digital database. Um, you know, I think with the Asante return that we did at the Fowler to Ghana in 2024 that Carlee mentioned, you know, when we found the original cards that came with the pieces when they came into to the museum, it wasn't just saying that these pieces were looted. It was saying who did it, on what date. It was the overwhelming desire to record some of the worst parts of the histories of these objects that kept popping up in the archive. I think as a more positive in the archive, something that always excited both of us, I'm going to put words in Carlee's mouth here, was um, watching the steps of people's research over time, that you could see how researchers from either when they received the auction catalog, then they worked for Sir Henry Wellcome cataloging these pieces, and then the graduate students at UCLA, you could see them changing attributions, cultural groups, as someone with more specific knowledge sort of like entered the chat essentially. And so you can see that change over time, and sort of how scholars who never meet over 100 years can be in dialogue with each other in the shape of the archive. And I think that was something that was um, just consistently exciting and kind of fun to witness, and then to think of ourselves as a part of that as well.
Okay, well, I've got more questions, but there's some interesting ones coming in on the Q&A. Do either of you want to choose one to respond to?
Sure. Oh man, now there are many. Um, To Margaret's first question about the commissioned works available online, is that I'm assuming that's the extra texts. They aren't on the website right now, but I think, I think that's something we could do. We could add those to the exhibition page so that people can see those as well. Um, I think they have much more resonance if you're seeing them in the gallery. But right now we have some really great PDFs with images, so you can still get the experience there.
Could I just jump in, since we're
Yeah.
talking about those the cards that you showed, and they take the form of actual cards in the gallery that somebody can pick up and walk around with. One of them that you mentioned was on material studies and conservation science, of course, which is what we do. So my ears picked up. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that one? What the content is?
Let's pull that one up.
Yeah, you want me, I can share the material, the conservation one. Sorry, let me just go back to my share screen here. Yeah, I mean, this was when we had Marcy working on this, we really wanted her to take on different materials to really get at these different processes that conservators and people who are working with materials think through. And one of the things that I especially love about what Marcy wrote is that she does not shy away from just putting in every single technique, technology, micro samples and XRD and mass spectrometry. I can't even say them. The TDPY GCMS, it's like it's just she gets so wonderfully specific and nerdy in her texts here that is giving people this totally different type of expertise. But especially with I think, oops, sorry, the OWO head, there was, that she did this work on copper alloy, and she did a lot of work on copper alloy when she was here. And so she's bringing this sort of deep knowledge of colonial era copper alloy objects to this text. I don't know. Carlee, is there anything else you want to add?
No, I love working with Marcy. It's such a different. So we shared an office for a long time, and like the questions that we would ask of an object we would come from so many different angles, and I think it really helped to push how we were understanding those objects. I'm sitting from art history, museum studies side. She's thinking about materials and materiality, and how do we use different tests to think about these things, and what does that tell us about environments and how things have been treated over time. And I think for the students who are involved in this call, I think it's such a great encouragement to think about the benefits when you have a prolonged engagement with someone who's across a different field from you, because you're going to push each other in many different directions. And I don't think much of our work is only thanks to questions that emerge from the collaboration that we had together. When you're, I don't know what that means. What are you actually asking of me? Can we figure that out? And moving forward from there.
Yeah.
Sounds like an ideal collaboration that you had. Should we pick another question that came in? I could pick one, or you want to choose one?
Oh, there's so many.
There are so many. Why don't you pick one, Glenn?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this one from Savannah Dawson. It's rather long, so I won't be able to read the whole thing, but she's asking if you could speak a little bit more about the Nigerian artists' perspectives and colonial impact on stripping cultural contexts as they're represented in the exhibit.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of these pieces, I think another reason we wanted to take it through these many steps is that we were also showing sort of where the archive begins and as far back as we can go. So for many of the pieces, we really can't trace it back to the community of origin. We get as close as maybe a cultural group, or even just a country. And so that is, I think that we have many other exhibitions where we get into that, what the source community, what the descendant community thinks about these objects. And in this exhibition, that is why we wanted to take this other approach, that when we are constantly focusing on use and source communities, it sort of doesn't allow us to effectively problematize how taking an object out of context changes our understanding of it. And so that was also why we wanted to start with our section on African owners and makers, that we wanted to foreground those voices, that those are first, to remind everyone that the first point on any provenance chain, especially for these kinds of pieces, is going to be someone in Africa. Well, I guess with the exception of Adumai Alijeto, who was not in Africa when he made it, but still, someone in Africa, whether their name has been recorded or not. And sometimes we just can't get back there. And so giving that sense of movement over time and space was really what we were looking at. But for those kinds of perspectives, I think it's just it's also valid, and it's just a different show.
Well, there are scores of questions coming in.
Yeah.
Let me just ask another one. Maybe you're scanning them as well. If you could choose one, but this one came in from Sarah Marcus. Do you find that the Fowler's current outlook towards repatriation and how the institution defines and understands cultural heritage directly stems from the foundational values and purposes behind the creation of the Fowler Museum?
It's an interesting question. I think, I think that the Fowler's current outlook towards repatriation it has been something that we've come to, but it's because of our history. I think that we have always been an institution that is deeply invested in bringing in community voices and diaspora and source community voices. This is something that has been a part of our shows going back to the 80s. And I think that having that focus that is always on speaking to, previous owners and makers has really informed where we are today. I also think that this is part of being within a university like UCLA that has also led us to this place. I think university museums, and this is sort of one of my things I like to talk about, but I think university museums, because we are within academic institutions, we have the ability to sometimes push the envelope and push boundaries a little bit more as to what is possible within ethical collections care. More so than municipal museums, larger institutions, that because we are here really thinking about what is, from an academic perspective, at the forefront of conversations about, how we best care for the objects that are temporarily within our custody. I think that really is sort of like the work of a university museum. So yes, I think it's about our history. I think it's about UCLA. I think it's all of those things that have sort of come together to, in this moment, create this approach that the Fowler takes.
Yeah, and I mean, we can fold in some of the other questions from the Q&A
Yeah.
here. Like it very much builds on the original foundational ethos of the museum before it was called the Fowler Museum of Arts and Technology, Museum and Laboratory. Chancellor Murphy really was a spearhead for the creation of this institution. And that's at the same time, like contextualizing this within UCLA's history as the founding of the Area Studies Center. When you start to see the university expand outside of its traditional academic structures. The 1960s is also when we have the founding of the Peace Corps. Someone had asked a question about the Peace Corps. And so the 1960s is a really interesting time in which the field of museums is changing, the academic structure is changing, the way that US is interacting with the world is shifting. And so we can think about all those things building into like the arrival of this gift, because of UCLA's various missions, they're able to convince the former owners of the collection that this is the place it needs to go. It arrives at UCLA and off we go, arriving in 2026 with this great project.
Looking at Caroline McGuire's question about did we come across other objects where scholars and researchers are divided about the history of the object? And how do we reflect that ambiguity or disagreement among scholars in the exhibition? I think Carlee did a beautiful job of that in particular histories with one mask. If you want to talk about that as a great example, Carlee.
Sure. So we're thinking, I mean, yes, there's so many examples of that. I also point to the former exhibition page for particular histories. We'll have several resources that are still linked there, I believe. But in thinking about how scholars can't agree on something, we have this incredible piece that was in particular histories that can be defined a context of use in 3 different ways. I've asked every scholar, artist, practitioner that I can ask about this mask, and every single one answers me emphatically, it is this, it is that. And then you say, well, your friend 2 days ago told me something else. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Huh. And so we start to really break down what it means to jump to conclusions from the archives, from a visual description of an object, from a photograph, from seeing it in person, and to really, as Erica was saying, like jump into this space of conversation about what has been lost. We'll probably never know what that mask was actually originally intended for, but because we have all of these other opinions layered on top of us, and on top of that mask, it allows for a absolutely fascinating case study of the implications of the loss of the knowledge.
And one of our other sort of favorite examples in that ilk is also a Cameroonian throne that on the records that came with it when it entered the collection, it claims that there was a card affixed to the throne that gives this history that it was looted from this kingdom, taken at great, potential personal peril to the looter. And when you dive into all of the various the names, the dates, the places, none of it adds up. It's supposedly looted at a time when there were no Europeans in Cameroon, looted from a kingdom that doesn't exist. The name of this kingdom does not track or align with any others, and it's a type of throne that was made for export. It was something that was intentionally targeting a German colonial style and interest, and so it's looking at the inconsistencies and the places where people disagree in the archive has also been really wonderful for sort of exposing what was done to sort of give objects value in Europe at that time. Understanding how these histories of the market really have, coming from Europe, have changed how we understand the objects and the object histories.
Hey, well, The hour is up. I feel like we could go on easily with so many
Questions.
more questions that I have and so many that have come in from the audience. But to be fair to everybody who's worried about time, I think we will need to end. And just, once again, Erica and Carlee, congratulations on a really wonderful, interesting exhibition that just lifts the veil off of so much. Regarding people associated with these objects over time and place. So I encourage everybody to come and see the exhibition at the Fowler
Please do.
Museum. How long is it up?
It is up through September, I believe.
Oh, so
You
you've
got
got
time.
time. Okay, great. Well, thank you both, and thank you everybody for joining us today.
Yeah.
Thank you
And
so
thank
much.
you so much, Glenn. Yeah.